were able to come up with is basically the Woodson and Garvey's attempt at um, public uh, releasing, what was the right word? Um, African history and to society, and attempt to implement in education as well, but uh, hit a few roadblocks along the way, such as people critiquing their published work.
Okay. Thank you, Francisco. Anyone else want to add to the thesis? If not, we can move on to who is Marcus Garvey or who is Carter G. Woodson, and why does their legacy inform Pan-Africanism? So according to the text, who is Marcus Garvey? Or why is Marcus Garvey significant?
Marcus Garvey was the leader of the largest mass movement in Afro America.
Perfect. Thank you, Francisco. Someone
Uh,
besides Francisco. Oh, sorry, go
he
ahead, Brian.
was he was a Jamaican-born activist and leader who was founded in the Universal Improvement Association.
Perfect. What about Carter G. Woodson? Who is Carter G. Woodson, and why is he significant?
He was
Uh,
oh, sorry, you can go, Brian.
he established Black History Week, which then turned into Black History Month, which he's well known about for.
Yep. Anyone else want to contribute? Go ahead, Francis.
Yeah, adding on to Brian, he's a, well-known author who was able to popularize Black history in, to society.
All right, cool. So what I would like to do, because part of the questions regarding Marcus Garvey and Carter G. Woodson is how their legacies inform this idea or this notion of Pan-Africanism. I don't want to assume that we all know or understand or conceptualize what Pan-Africanism is, right? So I think spending a brief moment to kind of situate you all and provide you all conceptualization of Pan-Africanism is important. And I think we talked about this a little bit at the beginning of the semester, but just to kind of reiterate, right? This idea of Pan-Africanism is also informed by this notion of what's called the diaspora. And we know that you get this diaspora from a scattering, from a dispersal, right? In this context, we're talking about the African diaspora because we're dealing with Pan-Africanism. For me personally, I was introduced into Pan-Africanism as an objective, right? I spent about 5 to 7 years in the All African People's Revolutionary Party, which is a party that was cultivated by the organizing efforts of Kwame Nkrumah out of Ghana, Sekou Touré out of Guinea, and then brought to the United States by Kwame Touré or Stokely Carmichael. And they describe Pan-Africanism as an objective, right? The total liberation and unification of Africa and African people under scientific socialism, right? So this is this notion of Pan-Africanism as an objective. As an ideal, it's the notion that African people, African descended people, no matter where you're located, are all connected to the landmass that is Africa, right? So, and this is why for me, I don't look at myself as an African American, but an African residing in America, right? And I would think about those folks who are in spaces like Jamaica as Africans residing in the Caribbean, right? So this notion of Pan-Africanism centralizes and emphasizes that African connection, right? So why they were able to inform these notions of Pan-Africanism while yes, Marcus Garvey was born in Jamaica, he migrated to the United States and was able to produce the largest mass movement of African people in the world, right? And the Universal Negro Improvement Association had chapters not only in the United States, but in the Caribbean, in parts of Africa, and in parts of Europe, right? So it was very much a pan-African movement. Part of Marcus Garvey's intellectual and ideological thrust was this notion of repatriation for those who are scattered throughout the globe from the diaspora to return back to Africa and build up Africa, understanding that Africa is your homeland, right? Marcus Garvey also gave us the Pan-African flag, which is behind me here, right? The red, black, and the green flag. The red is for the blood of the people. The black is for the people themselves. And the green is for the land, the rich land and the resources of that land, right? So this is a brainchild of Marcus Garvey, who comes up with this concept of red, black, and green to symbolize Pan-Africanism. As you mentioned, right, Carter G. Woodson is the father of what we now know as Black History Month through his efforts to establish Black History Week. A lot of Woodson's work was around repositioning Black history to affirm the agency within Black people. But like Garvey, Woodson also had a global disposition. He thought broadly in terms of African people. He was not just concerned with Black folks within the United States, but also in Africa and other parts of the world, right? And so these are how the legacies of these individuals inform this idea of this notion of Pan-Africanism. From Woodson being historian, his history did not just cover US history or Black folks' happenings within US history, but global African history, which is why he's able to contribute to this notion of Pan-Africanism. So what we've read is a chapter from the book, The Pan-African Connection by Tony Martin. The title of that chapter, Carter G. Woodson and Marcus Garvey. Looking at the very opening page, 101, there's a passage from Carter G. Woodson in the preface that I think is a little bit important. It says, Negroes here and there in America have been hailed as leaders. The press has given them great praise, and their friends have sung their virtues in high tones. But a thorough analysis of these famous Negro leaders will disclose the fact that they owed their prominence mainly to the white men who considered such spokesmen as those persons through whom they could work to keep the Negro in his place, right? So what he's saying is those who are propped up and celebrated within this American lexicon, right? They're propped up and they're celebrated because those in power know that they're going to do what they can to keep Black folks subjugated, right? So let's unpack it. Obama, is he not celebrated in the American discourse around Black folks, right? He's widely celebrated as a great Black American, right? But if we're being honest about his 8 years in office, did Black folks' conditions or situations change? Nah, we remained in our place. So what Woodson is saying is those who are going to be celebrated, those who are going to be propped up, those who are going to be put on a pedestal by America, typically will do the work to undermine Black folks, right? And I think we could pull several examples outside of Obama as to how this becomes true, right? Looking at the actual text, the second paragraph, it states, Woodson was, among other things, a contemporary of Marcus Garvey. The Journal of Negro History, founded by Woodson, first appeared in 1916, the year of Garvey's arrival into the United States. The celebration of Black History Week, pioneered by Woodson, was begun in 1926, the year before Garvey's deportation to Jamaica. And just as Woodson, the historian, also indulged in politically activist causes, so too Garvey, the leader of the largest mass movement in Afro-America, was also keenly interested in Black history. So they're pointing out the connections between Garvey and Woodson, right? One, they're contemporaries. They're doing things at the same time, right? In the early 1900s. They're both concerned with history, right? It says, it stands to reason that the paths of these two men of the 1920s should have crossed. Garvey's publications commented regularly on Woodson and his work. The two men had mutual friends and acquaintances. Woodson's political activity brought him perilously close to being drawn into the Marcus Musco campaign aimed at Garvey's imprisonment and deportation. And Woodson eventually became a regular columnist for Garvey's weekly Negro World. So I think also what you can pull from that passage, right? The main intellectual production of the early 1920s are these journals, right? The Journal on Negro History, Marcus Garvey's The Negro World. And they say that, you know, Carter G. Woodson was a frequent contributor to the Negro World. Although they never really met each other, their lives and their works cross paths, right? Looking down at the bottom of page 102, the historical interests of Garvey, Bruce, Ali, and Brown are symptomatic of a very widespread interest in Black history among Garvey's lieutenants. Among the editors of the Negro World were such professional and amateur historians as Hubert H. Harrison, William H. Ferris, and Bruce himself. Other Black historians such as Schomburg, Ali, and J.A. Rogers could be found among the paper's regular contributors. It comes as no surprise then to find that the Negro World was a frequent and favorable commentary on the work of Woodson and his association for the study of Negro life and history. So again, the Negro World was in conversation with Woodson's work. On page 103, he implored Woodson to be careful, for nothing could have been a more harmful effect on the Negro than a history dictated by white capitalists. So let me go back a little bit, because I think this is an important part. I'm gonna read that full paragraph starting on the bottom of 103, on the bottom of 102 going into 103. So don't start bothering him. Do something productive. Did you read? Sorry, I got to deal with my kids. All right, so on the bottom of page 102, a spate of such commentary took place in 1922 when Woodson accepted a grant for $50,000 from the Carnegie and Rockefeller Foundation. Robert Lincoln Poston, sometimes a UNIA Secretary General, acknowledged the predicament that Woodson found himself in. Woodson's cause was worthy and his funds were inadequate. Who was he to console Woodson against taking money from in those circumstances? He, being Garvey, employed Woodson, though, to be careful, for nothing could have been more harmful, have a more harmful effect on Negroes than a Negro history dictated by white capitalists. William Ferris expressed the same concern, and the Negro World editorial commented on Woodson on the gift while harboring the same reservations. So Woodson found himself in a place where he was trying to get his work out, but he didn't have the finances to be able to do so, right? And he was able to secure about $50,000 from the Carnegie and Rockefeller Foundation. Now, the UNIA and Garvey was like, yo, you might want to be careful with that, because once you take their money, they're going to dictate the type of work that you seek to put out. Right. And for those who follow the work of Woodson, you see that he takes this information and later would use that as a critique for some of the other Black folks, W.E.B. Du Bois in particular, who was taking money from these white benevolent, folks, but also within taking that money, they sought to control the type of activism and the type of intellectual production that these folks were able to do. He says the reservation expressed over this gift were rooted in the doctrine of Black self-reliance, one of the ideological rocks upon which the UNIA was built. It was consistent with this position when, in 1927, the Negro World columnist S.A. Haynes rushed to the support of Woodson in his effort to independently raise $20,000 for the preparation of Negro history. So he's letting you know, right, that for the UNIA and for Garvey, right, one of the premier pillars was this notion of self-reliance, right? If you're going to do something, do it yourself, right? Make sure you are able to accumulate the means to accomplish what you will, right? Don't look for the outside resources, because once you begin to take money from outside sources, again, they will begin to control and dictate how your work will take place, right? And And it says that, once Woodson stopped dealing with the white benevolent benefactors and sought to raise $20,000 on his own accord, right, members of the UNIA were willing to support. We'll go to that. Okay, I'm looking at page 106, the first full paragraph. That though it would be stretching a point to argue that there was a complete identity of ideological position between Woodson and Garvey, Woodson's articles nevertheless revealed a substantial area of ideological similarity. His ideas were similar to Garvey's on the questions of history, self-reliance, race pride, the fear of re-enslavement and extermination, a possible amalgamation of Black churches, and frustration with the antics of highly educated elements. One of the things I think that's important to talk about when you think about Marcus Garvey, he had an uncanny ability to establish this Black pride and what they call race pride, right? And one of his abilities to do so was his profound understanding of the aesthetic, right? Of how we look and how we present ourselves in public. And one of the things that he would do, especially in Harlem, right? Because his home base in the United States was in Harlem. He would have these really large and grandiose marches through the streets of Harlem. And he would dress up in this really extravagant regalia, right? And it would be like the equivalent of someone who is a decorated or celebrated war hero, right? And his thought behind this, right, was just how like military men, when they return to service, they get this certain level of dignity and respect that they're offered, right? He says it's the uniform that offers that. So I'm going to do the same thing and create a uniform for the Black soldiers in my army, the UNIA, to give them some type of pride and some type of dignity. So when they're viewed in the streets wearing their uniform, they'll get the same treatment as these other soldiers who return back from war, right? So this is one of the ways that Marcus Garvey was able to create this sense of race pride. He says that all races have their own flag of national origin or identity, right? But as Black folks, we don't. So we'll make our flag of identity, right? Because we also need to be viewed as a nation, and nations have flags. So we should have ours, right? Nations have a military, so we should have ours. Nations have a naval component, so we should have ours. So he developed what's called the Black Star Line, right? And it was a naval enterprise that took goods and services and trade opportunities back and forth across the Atlantic to allow Black folks to trade with other Black folks throughout the world, right? Also, as a means for repatriation, as a shipping line to take African people from the diaspora, whether it be the Americas, whether it be the Caribbean, whether it be Europe, and take them back into Africa, right? And his notion was, if we could do for ourselves, it will further exacerbate the pride that we have in ourselves, right? So this notion of race pride was central to Marcus Garvey and his success, right? They say that another thing that Garvey and Woodson had in common was their disdain for the highly educated Negro, right? And for those who know Carter G. Woodson outside of just Black History Month, his most famous text is The Miseducation of the Negro, right? And in this text, he argues, as Black folks get higher and higher up their educational pursuits, they get further and further estranged from their community, right? So myself, as I pursue my Ph.D., Woodson argues, I'm getting more and more out of touch with the everyday Black folks that I come out of, right? And this is his critique of educated Negroes. Hence the miseducation, because you think you're educated, but you're really not. You're being socialized to adopt and believe in white ideals that are detrimental to your own well-being, right? And Garvey also had this sentiment, whereas Woodson more so classifies it in the standpoint of intelligence, right? Garvey's looking at it from a standpoint of class, right? Like these uppity bourgeois Negroes, right? And this is where his disdain comes, but it's very much similar and in line with Woodson's critique, right? Woodson also took a position similar to Garvey on the Booker T. Washington versus W.E.B. Du Bois debate. Garvey was an avowed disciple of Washington. Woodson praised Washington in a Negro World article of July 16, 1932, for his observations that the Negro is segregated from his white neighbor, but white businessmen are not prevented from doing business with Negro neighborhoods. In 1923, both Woodson and Garvey had guest lectured at Tuskegee during the same week. In the index to Woodson's Miseducation of the Negro contains two favorable references to Washington and nothing at all on Du Bois. Now, I think what we could kind of do, if we're looking at the legacy of Black radical thought and this debate that is at the center of W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, right? This debate was about what should be the purpose and the aims of Black education, right? Should it be vocational? Should it be about job training? Should it be about labor, right? And this is the position of Booker T. Washington. Or should it be about evolving the whole human being, right? This is the debate that's taking place in the Reconstruction era. And through this debate, you know, you have folks kind of choosing sides, right? And Martin is letting us know that both Woodson and Garvey was in alignment with the notions of Washington, this idea of picking yourself up by your bootstraps and using labor to provide us our equality, right? I think with the advantage of history, right, with what they say hindsight is 2020, with the advantage of hindsight, we know that there was some holes in Washington's position, right? And we know that this notion of vocational training has now produced this, what's called vulgar careerism, right? And where this kind of stems from, if I ask you all now why you're in this class, why you're going to school, right? The majority of people, and we'll have your outliers, but the majority of people will tie their schooling to job occupation, right? This is why you're going to school, to get a good job. I'm going to school to make money, right? I'm arguing that this is a byproduct of Booker T. Washington's position, right? The way that we get free is through labor. And so now if we're getting free through labor, then the job becomes important, right? Whereas W.E.B. Du Bois is saying, like, hold on, jobs are not, we need to have full functioning human beings. Because chances are, what if the jobs ain't there, then what? And the reality became, once you got out of your vocational school, there was no job to occupy. Because who controlled the jobs? Who is it, Harlan?
White people.
Exactly. So if white folks control a job in a highly segregated, in a Jim Crow era, regardless of your training, homie, you ain't getting that job. It don't matter, right? So what Du Bois is saying is we need to train full, well-rounded people who have the ability and the intellectual capacity to attack this problem that we have, which is called race. Because just to say to go get a job to get you your freedom, that's not going to do it. How many of y'all got jobs and are still operating under racist situations, right? That ain't changed shit. It makes me think about Henry Louis Gates, maybe about 5-10 years ago, where he's a Harvard professor, right? Well-known, well-renowned Harvard professor. He gets locked out of his house. He's trying to climb in the window of his own home, and the police harass him, right? So his education, his job as a Harvard professor, his prestige, it did nothing for him. He still got treated like a Black man trying to break into some shit, right? So while there is this debate going on at the time, and while I agree by and large with Woodson and Garvey, right? As it pertains to this debate, I have to side with Du Bois. We should have an education that informs all aspects of who we are, not just our capacity to earn jobs or be laborers. sells us short, right? I don't want to get into that. It says, closing out this section, it says Garvey's death in 1940, however, introduced Woodson to make a public assessment of the man and his career. His obituary, published in the Journal of Negro History, still holds its own as one of the few sensible assessments of Garvey to come from a member of the highly educated element, the element to which Woodson belonged by training, if not by sentiment. Woodson paid homage to Garvey as a real leader of masses of Black people and ended, as Garvey might well have done had he been able to write his own obituary, with a scratching attack on those, no doubt highly educated famous Negro leaders who owned their prominence mainly to white men, desirous of using them against the best interests of their own race. So he's saying that, Woodson wrote an obituary for Garvey and placed it in his journal. And as he closed out the obituary, he closes with a critique of these highly educated, these highly celebrated Negro leaders who served white interests, right? And I think for me, this sounds very similar to someone who is birthed out of the tradition of Marcus Garvey, that's a widely celebrated Black nationalist, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, Malcolm X, right? Because if you listen to Malcolm X's speeches and you listen to who he critiques, he's very critical of the handkerchief head as preachers, the handkerchief head as leaders, right? This is the language of Malcolm X. This stems directly from Marcus Garvey, because if you know Malcolm X's history, his father, Earl Little, right, was a Garveyite. He was a preacher of Marcus Garvey's theology. In fact, what got Earl Little, Malcolm X's father, murdered was him teaching Garvey, right? When he was in Omaha, Nebraska, he was laid out on the train tracks, his back of his head bashed in, and the train ran over him, right? And they said that it was a suicide. And this prevented Malcolm X's family from being able to collect the life insurance policy that they had on their father, which ultimately drove their mother into a psychiatric state. And she had to go into a mental health care facility, which drove Malcolm into the foster care system, right? But the point I want to make is, literally, quite literally, Malcolm X is the son, ideologically, of Marcus Garvey, right? His father was a Garveyite. His father was a high-serving lieutenant in Marcus Garvey's army. So a lot of what you hear out of Malcolm X stems from what he learned from his father, which made a lot of what was being spoken about in the Nation of Islam comfortable with Malcolm, right? Like, yo, don't eat pork. My pops used to say shit like that all the time, so that makes sense to me, right? Work for our own. My pops used to tell me stuff like that all the time, so that makes sense to me, right? So what I'm trying to get you to understand is Marcus Garvey kind of sits on top of this tradition, this Black radical tradition that produces the likes of Malcolm X, that produces the likes of the Black Panther Party, that produces the likes of Khalid Abdul Muhammad, if you want to go there, right? This is the tradition that they follow, right? And I'm not going to say that Du Bois is on the other side of that spectrum, because one thing about Du Bois, he damn near lived 100 years, right? And if you live a long time, you change your positions, you evolve. And while Du Bois starts off very elitist with ideas like the talented 10th, he dies in Ghana, a Pan-Africanist, working under Kwame Nkrumah, producing the Encyclopedia Africana, right? So he may start off on the opposite side of Garvey and Malcolm, but by the end of his life, he's on that same intellectual and radical tradition as Garvey and Malcolm, right? So I'll put a pause on my lecture there. We'll open it up to Fishbowl. You can talk about the breakout questions. You can talk about anything you found of interest in the reading. You could talk about what was discussed in your notes. You have 2 times to volunteer, 2 times the Fishbowl for your participation points. Are there any volunteers? Harlan, all right, thank you. Anyone else? And ain't a lot of y'all, so you might as well get your fishbowl points in like real quick while ain't nobody here. Anyone else want to volunteer? If not, I'll call on random. We need 2 more people. All right, Francisco. 1 more. Brian. And we have Francisco, Brian, and Harlan. Who would like to start us off? All right, go ahead, Harlan.
Going over Garvey, it was interesting because I like conscious rap. Certain conscious rappers, they'll mention names like Malcolm, Garvey, Huey, Dr. Sebi.
Yeah.
So I caught, how could I phrase this? The name Garvey just kind of sparked something in me, and I had to go back and listen to Kendrick Section 80. And I have the bar right here. It says, last time I checked, we was racing with Marcus Garvey on the freeway to Africa till I wrecked my Audi. And there's other rappers that reference him as well. But those are, when I hear rappers mention names like that, I always have to look it up and check it out for myself.
You familiar with Dead Prez?
Yeah.
So like this whole RBG, right? So my fault. So Dead Prez, like, so now most recently Stickman of Dead Prez has things like RBG Fit Club. They have this RBG movement. RBG is red, black, and green. This is what that stands for, and it's representing that flag, right? It symbolizes that Marcus Garvey and that Garveyite notion. Public Enemy, the same thing, this notion of the red, black, and green in Garvey. So absolutely, you see Garvey honored tremendously in hip hop. Brian or Francisco, who's next?
Harlan, what was the name of the song you mentioned? I'll write it down.
Section 80,
High Power.
High Power, that's what it is, High Power, yep.
But J. Cole.
Yes. In the reading, what I did find interesting was when they how black graduates they would receive a brainwash that left them saturated with an inferiority complex. I found that interesting. Just like trying to get like more information off of that. Would that signify that getting a higher education would be deemed like harmful to society instead of like trying to improve the black community?
Yeah, that's what he's arguing with Francisco. I'll put it to you like this and try to leave some time for Brian to discuss as well. So as I mentioned, right, I'm getting my PhD. I'll be done in December. When I first started my program, I was told by my counselor that the objective of your PhD program is to break you down and build you up a new person, right? But what you mean by that? Like, I like who I am. You ain't got to break down shit, right? But the idea is, right, we're going to break down what you think you know and instilling you these new ideals. 9 times out of 10, those new ideals don't, as a black man, right, as a black individual of African descent, they're not going to inform my experience. I'm going to learn about Socrates. I'm going to learn about Plato. I'm going to learn about all the high theory whiteness that they deem important, but rarely does that speak to my personal experience. I won't learn anything that's going to help me liberate the minds of other African people, because that doesn't serve the interest of the state, right? So this is what Woodson means, is like, yo, the higher education that you receive, the more harmful it is for non-white folks, to call it what it is, because I'm expressing it from the terms of blackness, but I would argue anyone else on this Zoom call going through this process, it at some level devalues or demeans your true sense of self, right? Unless you're in like a Pan-African studies class, Chicano studies class, something of that nature, the predominant normative curriculum in these schools aren't going to affirm us as a people. And this is what Woodson's trying to get us to understand, is like, and then also, right, it warps our understanding of academic success, because now all academic success equates to is job obtainment, right? Whereas before, for African people, academic and educational success meant freedom, right? Think about the people who it was illegal to read, right? They made it illegal because they felt like if you read, it would make you unfit for enslavement, right? Because you know that you're more than just a tool to be used for labor. So this is why he argues that, obtaining education in this context, in the way that America, in the way that the West has been designed currently, it doesn't leave us educated, it leaves us miseducated. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes more sense now. Thank you.
Good question. Brian?
I feel like adding to all of that, I feel like Woodson's legacy was to challenge the racial narratives of his time and ensure that African American history was included in the mainstream historical studies. And I feel like his legacy still continues through like the celebration of Black History Month and the ongoing effort to recognize and celebrate Black achievements of the people.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And to your point, Brian, I think we're not giving enough credit to the legacy of Carter G. Woodson, because even now in like contemporary conversations around Black History Month, it gets diminished, right? Like, oh, it's just the shortest month of the year. That's why that's not why. He chose that month because Frederick Douglass was born in that month, right? So because we don't really understand who Carter G. Woodson was and what he did for us, we don't give him the full value and the full dignity of his work, right? Like, I agree that it's still, you see the remnants of it to this day, but I don't think it gets honored the way that it should, right? Like the way I see it, even my capacity to have a job right now is due to the work of Carter G. Woodson. Is his intellectual legacy, is his desire to ensure that our happenings in our agency is centralized, right? And because of that desire, there's departments of Afrikanist studies and Pan-African studies and things of that nature that do the work that he sought out to do in his early beginnings, right? So I think you're absolutely right, but I think we'll be well served to continuously engage the work of Woodson, right? Especially for those who are obtaining higher education, right? The reason why the project of breaking me down and building me up anew was unsuccessful is because I came in to my PhD program knowing about the miseducation of the Negro, right? Knowing about the work of Carter G. Woodson, knowing about the work in the legacy of Marcus Garvey. And I ensured that, I'm going to maintain that essence. I ensure that when I am built up anew, it's solidified in this, right? Any other questions, comments, concerns, or thoughts? Martin, what you thinking or feeling?
I thought it was interesting. Wait one sec. I'm gonna pull up my notes. I think I was interested in learning about Marcus Messiah Garvey. Like I did not know who this person was like ever in my life, and and I have a lot of like Jamaican friends, right? But they don't even know who this guy is either. They never told me about him. I think their parents know about him. So, and he was a big influence as like he was part of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and the African Communities League. So yeah, he's an interesting guy.
And I would argue, Martin, just because they ain't talking to you about Marcus Garvey, don't mean they don't know about Marcus Garvey.
No, I also not just that, like even in like my other Pan-African class in Canada, they never talked about this guy too. So yeah, that's what I was trying to say.
And to be honest with you, right, like the part of that is he was widely villainized. Have y'all heard of COINTELPRO? No? Have you heard, so you know about the CIA, right? The Central Intelligence Agency, right? Have you heard of J. Edgar Hoover? Yeah, okay, so J. Edgar Hoover is the person who comes up with the CIA. How J. Edgar Hoover got his start was by taking down Marcus Garvey. Now, if you follow the history of J. Edgar Hoover, he's destroyed Malcolm X, he's destroyed Martin Luther King, he's destroyed the Black Panther Party for self-defense. He was like intimately involved in the murder of Fred Hampton, right? This idea of COINTELPRO, counterintelligence program, right? That's the brainchild of J. Edgar Hoover, to where we'll tap your lines to see what you're planning to do so I could thwart those plans, right? Did I tell you about the beef between the Black Panther Party and the US organization that led to 2 murders at UCLA? Did I talk about that? For the sake of time, we'll talk about that on Monday. But that's also the byproduct and the work of J. Edgar Hoover, right? Have you seen the film The Rise of the Black, or you heard about the film The Rise of the Black Messiah? It's about Fred Hampton, starring Lakeith Stanfield, right? So that term, the Black Messiah, that stems from the COINTELPRO paperwork that says the biggest threat to the United States security is the rise of a Black Messiah, of a Black savior, right? And Martin states that Marcus Garvey's name was Marcus Mosiah Garvey. Even in his name is telling you that he's come to save us as a people, which is why he had to be eradicated, right? So again, the reason why J. Edgar Hoover became J. Edgar Hoover was because he was able to successfully neutralize Garvey, right? And they got him on some trumped up charges. They first tried him for tax evasion. That didn't work. And then it was something as minuscule as a letter that he sent with the wrong postage stamp or something like that, and they got him for fraud. And that's how he got imprisoned. And through his imprisonment, he got sick. And that's how he made his transition. But again, this is at the hands of J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover would do things like send letters from people who represent Malcolm X to Martin Luther King talking shit. And then soon send letters to Malcolm X from folks who represent Martin Luther King talking shit to provoke tensions between these two groups, right? So when I bring up COINTELPRO, I mean, as far as crack being in the ghettos, cocaine being in this, that's a CIA COINTELPRO program. This is one of the tactics that they use to stop the Black Panther Party, bring crack into the ghetto. Directly from the hands of J. Edgar Hoover, right? I would argue that if there's one motherfucker in the world who has his hands in the destruction of Black progress, J. Edgar Hoover, right? So I bring this up to say these are the reasons why we don't hear about Marcus Garvey. These are the reasons why he's not talked about like Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, right? He's been vilified. But also, he's been vilified because he created the largest mass movement of Black people anywhere. So we don't want to have that knowledge out. We don't want to let people know that that is possible, right? So we can't talk about that. Let's see. For next week, get that pulled up. Give me 1 second. I think next week we got some videos. We're gonna kind of break up the reading a little bit. For Monday, we will be discussing Black Wall Street, and I believe it's a series of videos. Yes, okay, perfect. So we got videos for that, and then for Wednesday, we'll be discussing the MOVE movement. So watch this for Monday, watch this for Wednesday, and that's what we'll be discussing. So you get a little reading break this week, but it's some fascinating material. It's really, really interesting. You'll hear about the first domestic bombing in U.S. history through Black Wall Street.